So I'll talk about how practices change in strategy, but it's a rather almost banal topic to talk about this day. So I thought I would rummage in the folk wisdom of the United Kingdom and remind people of the slogan of the Second World War. Now, why anyone should listen to the Brits at the moment, I don't know, but nonetheless. So what I'm going to do is talk about how practices change in strategy. I want to locate that a little bit within a broader agenda that I have, which is around taking a larger view of both strategy as a conventionally conceived of in the strategy discipline, but also in particular in the strategy as practice community, which is a community I've been involved in over the last few years. So that's part of my agenda, and I will start with that. Then I'll move to the substance of the paper, which is around how strategic planning emerged as a practice within strategy and then was supplanted by strategic management. And that's the substantive part of the paper, the empirical part, but I will elaborate a frame about how practices change in particular kinds of professions or occupations, and that is permeable ones. And there I will make reference to notions of institutional work, which Tom Lawrence, of course, has been involved in, and think about how practices change more generally. On that basis, on the empirical experience drawn from strategy, I think we can construct a general model, and in fact then I'll return to strategy in a way to consider my present interest, which is open strategy, and see whether we can apply, or touch on, whether we can apply the model we've generated earlier to the notion of open strategy as a set of strategy practices, which have become somewhat current today. So that's my broad agenda. Okay, so I'm going to do one quickly, stop quickly just in case you've got any remarks, and then I'll plunge into the empirical part of the paper and the model development. Okay, so we're going to carry on. So, for some time I've been frustrated about the strategy discipline. I'm possibly not the only one. But it seems to me to be limited in a number of ways. It seems to be what I've called here small. In other words, it's interested in just one thing, firm performance, an important thing. And it uses it tends towards a methodology which is quantitative and therefore large sample, which pushes it towards empirical studies of competitive industries where you can derive large samples. It seems to me that this is a worthy, an interesting endeavour, but still somewhat limited. And therefore, I've been thinking about the notion of what I call big strategy, which is concerned with the very, very large firms which exist in our world, which don't fall into competitive industries. We only have to think of anything from Google to Gazprom to immediately see those do not lend themselves to econometric studies of economic performance or financial performance, which is the standard strategy thing. Nor even are we convinced, perhaps, that they are profit maximizers. They have other things, they have many other effects, and we're not even sure that the people who run those firms care that much about profit anyway. So Brin and Page at Google insulate themselves from investors. Jeff Bezos at Amazon, goodness knows what he's about. Okay? But again, insulated from investors. So the notion of big strategy is to think about strategy as having a much wider set of effects than simply economic performance, and to be concerned with substantial effects rather than statistically significant effects in competitive markets. So big strategy is that more general claim, and then with David Seidel I've been thinking about in specifically the strategy as practice domain, enlarging the strategy as practice research agenda. Those of you who follow that agenda will be familiar with the preoccupation of the strategy as practice discipline, which has been on small episodes of strategizing practice. So ethnographic video ethnographies of strategy retreats or workshops or boardroom meetings discussing strategy. So very focused on particular moments and episodes of strategy work. What David and I don't need to bother too much with the long words here, are concerned about is enlarging the strategy as practice agenda. Strategy as practice is fundamentally about practices, strategy as practices. And what we think about typically in the strategy as practice is the sort of tools or methodologies, whether they're material tools or conceptual frameworks, the sort of things we might teach in an MBA classroom, or whatever. I think those are important, but we tend to think about them in the site, in the local site. What we have been less good at is thinking about the practices as things which have large effects, going back to the big strategy idea. So just to take 3 articles which have been fairly influential, or one form or another, way back in the 1980s, Hayes and Abernathy wrote a famous paper, not many of people will recognize it, remember it anymore, arguing that the decline of American manufacturing was in part attributable to the spread of strategic planning practices which emphasize portfolio management, short-term financial performance, and forms of conglomerate diversification. And they attributed the spread through consulting firms like BCG, which I'll come back to in a moment, of that particular practice, strategic planning practice, the decline of American manufacturing. That's a big effect. That's a big strategy question. Pankaj Ghemawat, in a review of the strategy discipline as it had evolved up until the early part of this century, argued that a market for ideas and concepts had emerged which put a premium on flakiness, flaky strategy ideas, and in particular the dot-com set of ideas. So Pankaj Ghemawat was arguing that strategy practices associated with the dot-com era were having ill effects and reinforcing what turned out to be a catastrophic economic event with the dot-com crash. Finally, to go to Clay Christensen's notions of disruptive innovation, we can think about those disruptive innovation concepts and frameworks which have become part of our everyday vocabulary in so many parts of our lives, including universities, the disruption of universities. As Gilles Lepore has said, very poorly empirically substantiated, but with very large ramifications potentially throughout societies as well as universities and health and things like that that Clay Christensen and others, Deloitte, have pushed these ideas into. So my idea here then is that strategy as practice, concerned as it is with strategy as practices, does have a larger agenda, and it's an agenda that matters because these practices, whether it's strategic planning, or the dot-com strategy practices of the late 20th century, or the ones surrounding disruptive innovation at the moment, are potentially dangerous. And so it seems to me to be an important agenda, therefore, to think about how these strategy practices are generated and then diffused within society, given their wider effects. So that's my preamble. Does that make sense? Would anyone like to comment or ask anything about this? Does that make sense? Yes, John?
Why should we not think that, like an evolutionary perspective, like the successful strategies survive and the unsuccessful ones?
Well, yes, successful. The trouble is the crowd effects. So they're not just purely competitive. As a certain set of ideas become legitimate, they tend to crowd out others. And so legitimacy may trump, if you like, damn, I've used that word, may trump the economic Darwinian processes of eliminating inefficient practices from others. So I'll talk about how McKinsey and BCG are able to legitimate these ideas in a way which suspends criticism. Is that the sort of answer you're looking for? Yeah.
So, The assumption here is that the source of this is in the intellectual community that is concerned with this issue. But for many of these issues, I'll leave disruption alone. But even there, a lot of them come mainly from finance. And the strategy just gets mediated.
I think that's to an extent. So indeed, the origins of the BCG matrix, which is the main, or that sort of thinking, which is the main target of Hayes and Abernathy, did have some financial origins too.
No, but portfolio theory is financial.
Exactly.
Nothing to do with that.
Yes, but as incorporated into the BCG matrix, eventually it went a long way beyond finance.
I mean, I think the diffusion of these these are institutional questions, right? Because, I mean, this didn't happen in every country.
This is exactly right, and that's one of the research questions I want to end up in finally. So I think we'll park that question or park that issue because I think it's an important issue to come back to. Thanks, Howard. Okay? Tepe.
I wonder if you're giving too much credit to strategy as an intellectual discipline in terms of being able to influence.
And why wouldn't I?
Yeah. I mean, so I wonder if these things are taken seriously, but there's a bigger question here, and this goes for any model, so Black-Scholes, you name it.
Yeah.
Do these models describe the world, or do they prescribe the world?
Well, Black-Scholes has been described as performative by, it has changed the world it describes. And I think to a certain extent, this might be one way of going back to Joel's question. To a certain extent, at least the suspension of disbelief through the enhanced legitimacy of these practices does create the world in which, for a period at least, they can be performative. Or they can perform. So I think that there's something in that. Okay? So anyway, my claim today, a day of big events, is that strategy is not merely trivial or limited to individual firm performance. There are more interesting things to think about in strategy. And one of those is strategy's practices. Hell, we have been disrupted today, haven't we? Okay, so I'll move on to the substantive part of the talk. And this is an empirical study. And what I want to do here is look at the rise of strategic planning and the rise of strategic management. These are not purely historical because the proposition from the model I'll develop is this is relevant to future practices and strategy, and it's also relevant, and that goes towards Black-Scholes, to the rise of practices in other similarly structured professions. Okay, so that's the claim. Excuse me. And what I'm doing deliberately here is connecting these just for individual practitioners, to these large practices because I want to link the micro-emphasis of strategy as practice, the emphasis on praxis or work by particular practitioners, to the rise and change and fall of others of practices at the macro level. Okay? So although I'm going to talk about broad trends, I want to keep an eye on what's happening on the ground locally in particular firms. And the particular firms are firms like General Electric, Shell, BCG, and McKinsey, Stanford Research Institute, SRI, and one or two others. Okay, Gemini as well. Okay, so, and those are some of the characters who appear in the paper which is behind this. Okay, so we're focusing on strategic planning and strategic management. This is a rather archetypal strategy as practice type slide, but the idea is simply that we have sets of practitioners who carry practices, they do work, institutional work, through that work they either reproduce or in some way change those practices. The work, the praxis, the moments of praxis are always local, but the practices may be transformed or changed at least on a macro level. Okay, and I think I've given you some examples of what I mean by practices, practitioners, and praxis on the slide. Does that make sense? And excuse my graphical skills; they're crap. Yeah. So anyway, that's what you see. So there are two episodes: strategic planning and strategic management. And well, the question then is, how do these things change? Hi, Tom. So strategic planning replaced long-range planning at some point in the 60s and 70s. Long-range planning was really about capacity filling. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the problem of management was simply to find enough capacity. General Electric increased by 10 times in the from the end of the Second World War to the early 1960s. So it was a real struggle to find the plant, machinery, and people to do stuff. Then, during the 1960s, strategy became more about choices, and with that came strategic planning. Later, strategic management emerged because strategic planning was around what should you do. Strategic management began to think about how it should be done, and it moved towards issues of implementation. Now, I'll give you a little more of a definition of all this in a little bit later, empirically derived from what the people on the ground at the time really thought it was. Okay? But that will be your working definition for the moment. And the argument is that how these practices rose and got superseded was driven by institutional work, Tom's phrase, creation, maintenance, disruption of institutions. And the key point about Tom's concept is, unlike notions of institutional entrepreneurship and innovation, it really puts the emphasis on continued maintenance, and there's a reason for that. And they do both framing, legitimizing, and delegitimizing work, and that's big in institutional theory. Legitimacy matters, and a lot of organizing work, for instance, creation of new firms, or the reorganization of strategy departments within large corporates. Okay? So, now here's the controversial bit, maybe controversial bit. I'm going to say that all this framing and organizing institutional work is mediated, or it's influenced by the nature of strategy as a profession. What? Strategy? Profession? I'm going to claim strategy as a profession in this very loose contemporary sense. We're not talking, and I will explicitly differentiate between law and accounting and strategy in a moment. We're talking about professional work as applying knowledge to, or professional knowledge to uncertain issues. And I love this, the remainder of this quote, because there's a lot of professional work going on, which professions are involved in birth through to our negotiations with the next world. Yeah? There's a lot of professional work about. And in that, strategy is a player. Okay? So I mean professions in that sense only. So it's not like accounting, it's not like law, it's not like medicine, and that, in fact, is the point. Because professions vary. So I'm taking Frank Parkin, Tim, you get your name checked. No photo. So Frank Parkin talked about professions varying in terms of closure, social closure. Some professions are closed through credentials or maybe state regulation. Not everyone can be a lawyer or a doctor. They have to go through intensive training. But anyone can be a strategist. There's no state regulation. There are no professional bodies which regulate. There's a lot of freedom and openness, in a different sense to the one I'll use it later. In other words, I think I'm borrowing your phrases. They're somewhat buried in your article, but nonetheless, they're there. Permeable and impermeable. Some professions have low social closure and others have high closure. Accounting and law being high closure, engineering somewhere in the middle. In fact, you put it towards the other end, I think. But if you compare it to things like journalism or public relations, strategy is a highly permeable profession. Because anyone can do it. People will typically go into a strategy role and not even stay there very long. The notorious McKinsey consultant, or whatever, if they do a strategy role.
So what makes it a profession?
That makes it a profession. It's around professional work. I call it profession in that sense there. It's around the fact that you're applying certain sorts of knowledge to things which are discretionary, have a lot of uncertainty about. And therefore, people to a certain extent have to trust you.
So, so you can define it that way, but I mean, like Andy Abbott wouldn't define it
Well, I'm sorry, Abbott wouldn't, but Abbott is sort of a little bit old-fashioned now.
I
Yeah,
understand the permeable.
yeah, yeah.
I
Abbott was
understand.
writing in the
But
1980s.
I mean, anything can fall in, right? I mean,
Well,
you
not
could be a-
quite.
You could be a chef and be a permeable profession, right?
I think that would be fair, yeah. Absolutely. You could call it an occupation, but I'm sticking to the language of profession here. And that's what contemporary sociologists, the professions, tend to go with. Okay? But you could call it an occupation if you feel very strongly about it. But the advantage of using the professional term is that I can draw then upon the sociology of the professions, which is quite well structured, and it allows us this contrast between some which are more open and some which are more closed. And strategy is at one extreme, and you might think it falls off the edge at the end, but that would be...
But I think if you're going to talk about diffusion of practices and standardization and all those kind of things, right, you probably don't want to...
There is no standardization. That's the point. There is no standardization because it is the permeable
thing, that's right.
exactly.
But
So
that could be an art.
yeah, let me just continue. Strategy is a permeable profession, unlike accounting. Then there are plenty of strategy professionals about. If you take, as you can see, the average chief strategy officer will have just at the headquarters about 7 professional staff. So if you just take the S&P 500, about half of those firms have CSOs, they have large staffs. Even those firms which don't have CSOs will have strategists at other levels. Since Henry Mintzberg wrote that irresponsible book called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning, people don't believe there's such a thing as a strategic planner anymore, but one meets them all the time. Consulting the same. It's a big, big industry. And McKinsey, if it does about 15 to 20% of its work in strategy now, will have about 2,000 strategy professionals just within McKinsey. Okay? So, excuse me. The point is, going to Hiram's point is, it's not a profession like accounting or law. It doesn't have standardization. It is too damned easy to get into. And that has consequences for the way in which work can be done. So if you want to change accounting practices, you capture state regulatory bodies or professional regulatory bodies. All your energy is devoted to the capture of those bodies, and then you impose the change, and more or less, with some small sort of things that Michael would notice, with some small local on-the-ground adaptations, a great deal of practice change will have been achieved. Yeah? So once you've captured those regulatory bodies, it's happened. It's different in a permeable profession. The implications of permeability mean, to use a Thornton et al. Typology, is that change is going to be either by blending or by what they call here, I think rather clumsily, but nonetheless I'll go with it, segregation, rather than by wholesale replacement, to use their jargon, or wholesale transformation, to use ordinary language, or fairly ordinary language. Okay, so what you get is you get people mixing together practices, doing a bit of strategic planning, a bit of strategic management in a hybrid, and gradually the blend changes. It gets stronger in one direction and the other, more strategic management. Or within a firm, or within consulting firms, you have 2 different organizational units. Or you set up a specialist unit, like BCG effectively was a specialist in strategic planning. Gemini became a specialist in, inverted commas, strategic management. So you could have segregation, and then the change happens through the occupation or profession as one sort of unit, the darker blue here, comes to dominate, the lighter blue, the previous bearers, the units, previous bearers of the old practices. Does that make sense as a little model graphically? And that has a big implications, I will argue, then, for the nature of the institutional work. Unlike in a profession like accounting, where you capture the regulatory bodies and you can achieve a lot of change that way, a lot of standardization change, you're continually working on this blend. And it's highly recursive in the ways that I'm going to suggest here. with a lot of invention and reinvention across organizations. So organizations competing between themselves will be more or less creating the same practices at more or less the same time, thinking they're doing it independently, but not really. There'll be a lot of iteration and reiteration over time. You keep having, instead of saying it's in the rule book, like in accounting, you keep having to reinforce it and adapt it, reiterate it. And then there's a lot of integration across practices, because as this change happens, you're either managing a blending or merging segregated units, and that happens over time too. So the argument here is that because the profession or occupation is a very permeable one, there's a lot of work which has to be done over time. Reinvention, reintegration, reiteration. So if you like, this is the argument so far. I'm going to move to the data. We have a permeable profession at a macro level. That means no practice standards. That means that change is going to be necessarily blended and segregated rather than wholesale transformatory. It's long, gradual, contested. That means a lot of recursive institutional work. And eventually that might produce practice change back at the macro level. Does that make sense? I'll just stop for a moment in case anyone wants to ask a question. Michael.
So the sense of permeability to the way you present it would mean that basically anyone could join the strategy profession.
Not quite.
Not quite, but more so than accounting.
Yes.
In the way you present the figures, though, it seems in this sequential model that almost anyone who joins the strategic planners is a strategic manager. But how do we account for, I mean, it feels like there is a very concentrated group of people, a very focused group of people joining the profession, joining this blend or this segregated. But wouldn't there be a much more diverse influx of views and approaches?
People will often call themselves not strategic planners or strategic managers. They'll just be doing their job, whatever they describe it as. So I'm not sure I've grasped your question, actually, Michael.
No, I mean, in the blend is this kind of, there is an existing permeable profession and there is a new type, new blend coming in.
Yeah.
But if they are genuinely permeable, shouldn't there be a much broader diversity of views coming in and creating more of a chaotic motion of views?
So I'm focusing on two practices here. There are many more practices going on all the time. And in fact, I've chosen these two practices quite important. They have academic ramifications, obviously in the Strategic Management Journal was created as part of this, and so on and so forth. So yes, the blend is more than just two flavours. I'm trying to think of an ice cream metaphor, but I can't. Okay, so that's the general picture. Just go into it. So the research, okay, so basically I've used secondary sources, published in grey literature. I've used advertising data for strategy jobs for the New York Times from the 1960s onwards. I've used archival data from the particular companies I mentioned there, but particularly General Electric and Shell. And I've used quite a lot of interviews, typically with influencers, because I'm concerned with this legitimacy and, here we are, so on and so forth. But particularly in these four organizations, to a certain extent, quite a lot Gemini as well, and quite a lot in SRI, who turn up as well, later as well, but not quite as much as these. Okay? This has been my hobby project for about 10 years. Yeah, which is far too long. So I've just been working on this on the side, but it's beginning to come together, I hope. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what I've been doing with my time, if anyone's wondering. Okay, so that's the data, just going back again. And then central case studies, and then what I'm looking at here is what is strategic planning. I was able to take from internal or published documents, no, in fact, in both those cases, published documents, what strategic planning was as they saw it at the time. You'll see that SRI very much focuses on goals, objectives, purpose, and so too did the BCG as it emerged early in the 1960s. The companies, General Electric, an internal document, their strategy workbook, internal guide and shell is effectively asking the same questions. What are we about? And that was what strategic planning was. No longer was it about how can we manage the capacity, we're just growing. Now what do we do was the issue. The advertisements somewhat illustrate the same thing, but you'll also see a combination of blending and segregation here. So one of the interesting things, you take a 1973 ad, you talk about strategic planners, but the illustrative ad here is asking them also to do long-range planning. So already you can see a little bit of the, as it were, blending or hybridization going on in these advertisements. Not in all advertisements, the one below is a more segregated form where they're just looking for strategic planners. I'm taking quite heavily edited extracts from the table, so it's not all the detail there, but you can imagine what the rest is. Okay, so strategic management is a shift. So McKinsey, when it was developing this idea in the late 1970s, and SRI as well, were beginning to emphasize something which was more the everyday responsibility of strategic managers rather than just strategic planners. Okay, and within the companies, you also saw, this is Michael Carpenter, a guy I talked to, Director of Business Development and Planning in the 1980s, emphasizing very much implementation, and the same was true at Shell. Their internal guideline, I forget which it was, yeah, strategic management. They had a particular guidebook which described what they thought strategic management was about. Okay, and again, the advertisements, interestingly enough, that 1980 advertisement is a hybrid or a blend of long-range planning, and strategic management, which is quite a blend. The other is not. Teppo.
So are you trying to describe a shift in overall logic and what strategy is over a time period?
Exactly. So I'm just taking effectively, all I'm doing is illustrating what they, in those time periods, thought it was. So I'm going to explain the process a bit more in a moment. Yeah.
So then back to your original point, is there any way to tease performance out of this? Because the story could be that we're trying something and then it doesn't work, or it blows up, or we tried the Black-Scholes model, we tried X model, and we find something better. So these things exist in an ecosystem of lots of different things that are happening. Yeah. And is there any way to tease out performance and say it's not about performance, it's about other stuff that's going on that's more sociological or whatever?
Well, my approach is more sociological. I think it's a legitimate point which Joel also raised. To a certain extent, one of the things which is very striking, and I'll show you in a moment, is how these practices endure for a very long time, even after they might appear to be in the academic world no longer legitimate. That might be a very rough proxy for performance, but I can't lead it down to individual firms. Mary?
But to explain the shift and change in the logic, it doesn't have to be performance-based, right? So
that's individual company.
In which the field is being really fine, and that gets back to my semantic question about what is the nature of the permeability. So how is the field defined?
Oh, right. Okay, the nature of the permeability. I think I'm beginning to understand. The penny is dropping, Michael. Sorry. Permeability comes in many ways. It comes in the ways of individual practitioners. It also comes in the form of new strategy consulting firms, for instance, or in the case of McKinsey in the late 70s, in a complete redefinition of what McKinsey was about. So permeability comes in terms of new, if you think about the occupation profession as an industry, through new entry in a very classic way. BCG was a new entrant too in 1964. Okay, so is that speaking something to that? So you could do this in a traditional industrial economics way, but I think it would miss all the sociological stuff which is going on around it. Okay, so you see quite a lot of blending going on in those ads. So what's the general pattern? Right. Now this allows me to talk a little bit to Teppo's point. If you look at the advertisements, what proportion of the strategy, I could explain how we identified these advertisements, but I won't now. But they're basically the New York Times. We took a sample of them and we looked at the proportion of ads which either referred to long-range planning, to strategic planning, or to, there's a reason for this, strategic management via the term implementation. Strategic management was more difficult to trace here. I could explain that a little bit more in a moment. But what you see in the 1960s is long-range planning was the dominant way of describing a strategy job. It collapsed. But, going to Teppo's point, not wholly. Through the 1990s, 30 or 40 years later, still accounted for about 1 in 5 strategy jobs. Okay? What replaced it, what superseded it, was strategic planning, and that's the work of achieving that is what I'm going to touch on in a moment. And that in turn reached whatever it was, 70%, 60 or 70%, plateaued, went down a little bit, but didn't disappear either entirely. As implementation, the trace word for strategic management, but it's not a... Yeah, you look suspicious of this. I better explain. Strategic management, the whole point of strategic management is that strategic management becomes the function of senior line managers. So it's less easy to trace through strategy job advertisements, specifically strategic management, because the whole point about strategic management is there shouldn't be strategy specialists. So the way we get at this is through, in fact, 3 trace terms: implementation, project, change, and the 4th we sometimes use communications. If you add them all up together, they get to be quite a large proportion. But I've just chosen implementation for simplicity's sake. Teppo.
So I'm wondering if this is sort of just bin framing. So say Saïd Business School advertises for a lecturer or advertises for an assistant professor.
Yeah.
We're looking for the same thing.
Now, I can believe that.
Is it sort of
What-
thin,
what-
or is it actually?
I think it's somewhat thick,
Okay.
partly because those are extracts from the text of these ads. The ads are typically quite descriptive, not always, and also because of what I have from the in-house guidebooks and so on and so forth within Shell, McKinsey, or whoever. Okay, so I have something more or less thick there. The other point I want to make is I'm looking at the way in which they can be blended or hybridized, if you like. So you sometimes see strategic planning with long-range planning, in fact, quite often. And you sometimes see strategic planning with implementation. So there's a bit of blending going on. And without lingering too much on this slightly complicated graph, what you notice is, what I notice in other measures that I'm not going to show you, blending tends to come initially, then you move towards a bit more segregation over time. But that's a detail. And it's not the strongest thing I can say here anyway. But you see a bit of blending as well as segregation. Okay, yes?
What does this look like for diffusion of accounting practices?
Now, that's a really good question. And what I think it would look like is something like a very, very, very gentle slope upwards. Then it's the new practice is incorporated in the general accounting applied principles, or whatever it's called. It goes up like that. And then it would go like that. So everybody would be told, you now do inflation accounting this way. And it more or less happens like that. But there will have been some experiments, there will have been some campaigning beforehand.
Would it be interesting to test that hypothesis?
Yes, it would be. This has taken me 10 years already.
Data on Chinese accounting practices
well-
changing very rapidly.
Well, so I would be fascinated. In fact, China is one of the contexts I would like to do more work on something. Hiram.
Along the same line, so you have the descriptive part of the job. Do you have the details of sort of what their sort of either the background might be? I mean, does it say MBA required?
Yeah, it says it gives you all your standard.
Has that changed? I mean, is there
So the interesting thing, MBA, you might be interested in this, Peter. MBA goes up, then falls as a proportion. But it's hard to interpret that because this is the New York labour market, New York Times. And I think the MBA was so diffused and so common that they no longer specified MBA in the same way because they sort of assumed it. Or that level of skills was so widely diffused. So the measure's not perfect for that. But you also, Bashak, Yakis Douglas and I have done some work on this together on the textual analysis. And there are other things you can associate with it. So this is a very broad-based. Okay, so here's the general model again. I don't put this in the paper because it's a bit too simple, but nonetheless, What I want to concentrate on now is just talk a little bit about that recursive institutional work, which relies more on the qualitative data, the archives, the interviews, and some of the published stuff. Okay? So, institutional work is strategic planning. I've divided between framing and organising, reinvention, reiteration, and reintegration. Ignore that table. In fact, it's a simplified table, which is rather even more dense. But I'll just give you a few examples. Reinventive work. So what was fascinating for me in the 1970s, in 1970, BCG, Arthur D. Little, and McKinsey each had sold more or less exactly the same portfolio planning model into General Electric. Different divisions and the corporate centre were using all three models. They're all exactly the same. The axes have slightly different labels, but they basically describe market attractiveness and competitive strength. And one's got 12 boxes and another's got 4, and I think another's got 9. Same thing. Reinvention by competitive. Same practice, but reinvented. You get reintegration work, BCG. BCG was slightly unfortunate. It got founded in 1963. And then what you can see here is from the initial advertisement to provide general counsel to corporate management in long-range planning and strategy. Then suddenly strategic planning got important. They spent a large part of their perspectives, if you know the BCG's perspectives, their first perspective and indeed their first management conference was on long-range planning. They had to spend the next several years trying to make sense of whether it was long-range planning or strategic planning and trying to, as it were, reintegrate the two together. Teppo.
So this gets at the crux of the issue. So we know there's a diversification discount, right?
Yes.
And so for a long time, 60s, 70s, we have all these matrices, you need to have cash cows, you do all these different things, and then we say, wait a second, if you look at public companies, there's a discount for being in lots of different places, right? And so it's suggested that model is we need to change that model. We need to go to something else. And so it's the performance that's driving the change in model potentially. That's what I'm worried about is you want to get out of talking about performance at the beginning, but it could be that performance is driving this because we know that diversification discount still exists.
Okay, so I think that's a perfectly fair point, and I've got another little 4 forces model which describes how things are going, one of which is economics, others are technology, society, culture. But if you just rely upon those exogenous performance forces, then what you miss out is the fact that this didn't happen automatically. It required a lot of recursive work. BCG didn't just happen. Bruce Henderson had to make sense of, all this stuff. And his skill in doing that created the firm which we know today, a very successful firm. So if you just rely upon the economic forces, what you ignore is the skill, the work that someone like Bruce Henderson had to do. And if you ignore the work, you have no consulting firm. You just wait for somebody else to do it. Yeah? So that's why I think that more sociological approach adds something to the economic forces, which I recognise are important there as well. And Jack McKittrick, who was the head of he wasn't actually called the head of strategic planning in General Electric in 1960, had introduced the concept of number 1 and number 2, which we all associate, or many of us will associate with Jack Welch as his famous slogan in the 1980s. But it was actually always part of the rhetoric of General Electric. And still you see well into the late 1980s, at least the archives I've traced, top management conferences where they say, our managers still haven't got number 1 or number 2. We've got to, and there's a word, hunt it out. We hunt those people who oppose it in every single corner of this organisation. We've got to hunt them out. So 30 years later, Jack Welch was still using the same strategic planning nostrum of number 1 and number 2. Okay? Institutional work is strategic management. Rather the same, with a bit of reinvention, reiteration, reintegration. This is something of a simplified version of it, but I can give you just a few examples. So, strategic management was invented, in inverted commas, simultaneously by SRI and McKinsey. Very similar models, in fact, by Fred Gluck and Carl Spettler, and somebody, both of whom I've spoken to. I haven't spoken to Scove. They published in 1979 these same sorts of models, and strategic management became part of our world. In fact, a consulting firm, a small consulting firm, had been the first people to invent the notion or publish on strategic management in 1970, but no one's ever heard of that firm. William and Charles Hill disappeared. It was McKinsey, an SRI dominant consulting firm at the time, who popularized this. And McKinsey helped set up the Strategic Management Society and funded the first Strategic Management Society conference. So my discipline derives from the work, the institutional work that Fred Gluck was doing. He reorganized McKinsey. He was nobody. He eventually became the head of McKinsey through this work, and reorganized them in a particular way. So there's reinvention, reiterative work. I mentioned Henry Mintzberg's dangerous book. One of the things which is very remarkable is reiteration means repetition time and time and time again. A bit like how Jack Welch had to hunt out those people who opposed the number one and number two thing. Isn't it remarkable that, well, it seems to me remarkable, that about 30 odd years after Walter Kiekel had said strategic planning is dead, Roger Martin, former head of Monitor, and then of course a dean at a distinguished business school till recently, still can publish in Harvard Business Review stuff knocking strategic planning. That delegitimization work, the disruptive work we might have talked about earlier, still has to be done continuously. In other words, economic forces or not, you can't just sit on your laurels, you keep having to reiterate the same thing. So the argument is, to go back, because of the nature of the profession, the occupation, its permeability, there's no standards bodies to conquer and on whose authority you can rely. You have to be continuously engaged in institutional work. You cannot let up. We still need Roger Martin. Harvard Business Review still thinks it's worthwhile reiterating this message, banal and dated though it might seem to anybody who, like me, began his research career in strategy in the early 1980s. Still a necessary kind of work to be done. Okay, so if I conclude, the reintegration work, Gemini did some reintegration work. Gemini was the strategic management consulting firm above all, and their way of integrating strategic planning was having a big projects with analysis and design, the strategic planning part, followed by results delivery, which was the more strategic management part. Yeah.
So is there an implied standard? So there's a status hierarchy in consulting, right? So who are your examples? BCG, McKinsey,
SRI, Gemini. No one really respected Gemini, did they?
There may not be formal standards. There must be some sort of informal standards.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. So effectively, the work of these firms is defining the context where BCG was able to create stuff around strategic planning, and the rest of the world followed.
And so when there's some sort of external contestation, right? So when people are saying that this stuff doesn't work, right? Those firms tend to be doing the reiterative, recursive work.
Yeah.
The means of justifying, forget the prices.
So that Corporate Strategists Are Under Fire article, those of you who did strategy in that generation will remember it as a controversial article. That was a piece of work by McKinsey. Mm-hmm. McKinsey was launching its new practice against BCG. Walter Kiekel, who I spoke to about this, was invited in, primed. All the examples, the good examples, are from McKinsey or McKinsey clients. All the bad examples are about BCG and BCG clients. So that sort of article, Walter Kiekel's article, is part of the work of institutionalization, legitimization of a new approach, the strategic management approach being pushed by Fred Gluck. against its rival BCG, which had appeared, in fact, in the 70s to have overtaken them. And BCG was an upstart, whereas McKinsey was apparently... BCG wasn't respectable until sometime in the 1970s. It was the noisy upstart. McKinsey was the more legitimate one, but they lost place. Yeah, Tom.
I wonder if there's, just thinking of Teppo and other people's comments, I wonder if there's two things going on. Like, permeability makes sense to me as a piece of it, but then I wonder about the performance side. You know, the kind of classic knock-on strategy is actually it's incredibly hard to find performance effects in these things, and when we do performance effects, you know, or try and find performance effects for actual strategic kind of activities, it's relatively difficult. So I wonder actually if the loose coupling between performance and strategy might be a part of...
I think it's a really interesting idea.
Because if you had a permeable profession, but one that had very strong causal relationships between their activity and performance, whatever it was, then you might not, you might have the churn, but you might not have that recursiveness over and over again as the performance was kind of shown.
Tom, that's really helpful because that helps me respond much more satisfactorily to Joel and to Teppo, because there's lots of studies in the 1970s and early 1980s as part of the legitimatory effort around strategic planning to say, do strategic planners perform better than non-strategic planners? And of course, early on, everybody said yes, but as people improved their statistical methods, it got much murkier, and whatever effects there were tiny, insignificant, or reversed from one study to another. So because these practices, and in fact, actually almost all things, the same is true for diversification, internationalization, almost all things in strategy are actually very hard to trace reliable, stable performance effects to, but particularly these practices, I think. That makes the sociological and legitimatory aspects of this still more important. Is that the point you're trying to make, Tom? I like that, thank you. Michael, then, excuse me, I don't know your name. Pedro.
Just to follow up on that, this is some literature in economics that might be interesting about this. So there's a lot of people who go to, for instance, developing countries and try to teach best practices.
Yeah, all that stuff by the LSE people, yeah.
That's right. And
even
if,
is that unfair to them?
And even though the best practices on average you can actually measure exactly the performance increase on average.
Yeah.
But things are noisy, it's hard to learn. I mean, it's very hard to map. And people, even if the data is kind of almost always there, it's even hard to
I've written a critical paper of that. It's not a very good paper, but this is the what are the names of the people who particularly.
the flow comes to mind.
Yeah. Anyway, they look at practices introduced into an Indian textile factory, Bloom's work, and people like that, Van Reenen and all that. They look at a practice introduced into some factory in India. Yeah. So what they don't do is they think about the practice only. Strategist practice view would say, look at the practitioners and look at the praxis. So the people who introduce these are consultants from the West, supervised by LSE and Harvard academics. There's a bit of a Hawthorne effect going on there, isn't there? Yeah? And what they don't know either, they more or less know the practice was there, but they don't know how it's adapted. And one of the things we know about from TQM, in particular, and many other shop floor practices to which great things are attributed, is actually the successful TQM is typically highly adapted in the particular site. And so the Van Reenen and Bloom's work, I think, is fallible precisely because it only focuses on practices, ignores what the strategist practice people would always talk about, practitioners and actual praxis. So yes, that's a good example. Thank you, Pedro.
The other example I was talking about, that even like farmers trying to get into best practices, even teaching them very well, these things can be difficult because the learning process is inherently difficult.
So that's a very nice example. Thank you very much. Michael, you had a point.
Yeah, I thought also, I mean, that's not something I've just realized, and I think it was implicit in you. But when we talk about those consultants, to me it feels we're talking a lot about the producers of strategy, so to speak. But I think the advert you're looking at, that's more like the consumers. The consumers of strategy, or the consumers of this advice, but then we know from the professional service literature that there is a lot of collusion in terms of constructing performance. So it's relatively difficult to find clients to actually say that they've wasted a huge amount of money on consulting advice. So
a bit like MBA students, yeah.
You may say so. So I think that there is an additional effect that is more institutional than performative, because producers and consumers of these new strategy practices actually collude in the construction and potentially pretense of performance.
I think that's exactly right. All this is reinforcing for me, as I would say, the value of taking a more sociological, legitimatory approach than one which is simply focused on economic performance. That might not be accepted by everybody. Yeah. But Tom's point is helpful, and Pedro's point has been very helpful to me there as well. Okay, thank you. Okay, so look, what does this, there's Gemini, there are some conclusions. So my argument really is, I think, in any permeable profession, or shall we call it, he's gone anyway, occupation, change is going to be slow. It's not going to be transformative or replacement in terms of Thornton et al.'s typology. It's going to be around blending, and it's going to be around segregation. With that, do you remember those two little graphics I did? Because of blending and because of segregation taking time, it's going to take a lot of work. We can't just sit on economic forces and expect this to happen. The work has to happen. In fact, in the paper and elsewhere, I've written about how in some firms it succeeds and in other firms it fails. So it's not just an inevitability, it's around the skills of the people, the practitioners, instituting these. Okay, so SRI, as you may be wondering who SRI are. That's because they failed, whereas McKinsey got it right. For SAP, and maybe for strategy more generally, what I'm hoping is that this will gives an instance or some sort of, I'm going to hesitate for saying model, but some sort of idea of how one might link micro-institutional work, strategy praxis, to macro-institutional change, that is, changes in practices, like from long-range planning to strategic management. Okay? And then I think, again, for Hiram and others, I think there would be an agenda, and indeed for you, in comparing more systematically different professions or the same profession or occupational group in different contexts. So in the public sector, Louise, there is a lot of regulation about how organisations do their strategies. So I wouldn't expect blended and segregated change in the public sector. I might say the same to Hiram about China, where there's a lot of state ownership. I would be interested to look at practice change in journalism and public relations to see whether it followed the same blended and segregated model. My instinct is it would, and that this would be sharply different. My instinct, again, would be the same, that it would be sharply different to practice change in accounting. And the kind of work you need to do to achieve those sorts of practice change would be different correspondingly. Okay, so that would be the sort of research agenda I think one could generate from this. So you remember that I said what comes next. If you allow me 5 minutes, no more than that, I think, and just touch on what I'm thinking about at the moment. I've been doing some work on open strategy with Bashak Yakis Douglas and others. David Seidel as well, doing a book together in a special issue at the moment. And I wouldn't say this is it. This is not the only thing that comes next. And in fact, the thing which I think is worthwhile considering in these terms at the moment, particularly, is the work around strategic innovation practices, the blue ocean practices, business model practices, and of course the disruptive innovation practices of Christensen with which I started. I would think that is the more natural and dominant set of practices to replace strategic management. However, I would like to touch on my little thing, which is open strategy. So if you think that we've had long-range planning moving to strategic planning, strategic management, maybe open strategy might be part of what's next. What on earth is that? Well, this is drawing on work that I've done with Bashak. in particular, is a combination of things. So I describe open strategy as involving greater transparency of strategic information, both to actors within a firm and externally, a more inclusion in strategy making processes, both of actors externally and of actors internally. And I've given you, just for simplicity, a few examples of those from blogging or strategy updates. Now, strategy updates, which are what chief executives will do to financial analysts in the financial markets, not all, but many, when they talk for a half day, they do a strategy day, or they might do a strategy afternoon at the end of their results, or something like that. They'll do a set of slides on their strategy and take questions from analysts and maybe specialized media, if they're there. Those seem to be increasing. And many of these other strategy, open strategy practices are increasing. So if you look at that top thing, that describes, you can barely see that, I apologize, but those are the Fortune Global 100, the firms which do regular strategy updates, talk about their strategy in the way I was describing a moment ago, I think has risen from not very many to, well, about a quarter every year. So that's quite a lot. So a lot of firms don't do it, but quite a lot of firms are doing it now. They're being more open about their strategy. And there's a little HBR piece there we cite there, which on the whole implies, you can't see all the detail there, that actually analysts welcome that. I take an economics approach, we take an economics approach to that, we do use the cheap talk idea. Are strategy updates just cheap talk, dismissible precisely because they have been made public, or do they have a real effect? Event study methodology suggests that they do have a real effect, and on the whole positive. Okay? So the idea there is that open strategies are a new set of practices which may be one of the sets competing practices which are important in the early 21st century. I think they could have major important effects. When I think about Google, when I think about Facebook, when I think about Walmart or Amazon, I think, how do we make these firms more accountable to society? They're not under competitive pressure. They're not clearly even profit maximizers. We can't nationalize them because they're too damned expensive, and probably it would be counterproductive anyway. We can't regulate them because they create their own markets. They know more than anything than we do about their markets, and again would be counterproductive. We know that markets don't impose competitive disciplines on them because they're monopolists, or oligopolists at least. So it seems to me, if you're going back to that big strategy idea, that there are a lot of big firms out there which are not subject to proper accountability either to investors or to the marketplace, but which have very large effects. And one way of perhaps offering more accountability is to introduce forms of more open strategy. So that if you run Google, if you run Amazon, you should damn well explain your strategy much more clearly. And it might even pay if you take the stock market returns, the event studies, to our strategy updates seriously. So my argument then is that open strategy can be seen as part of that big strategy agenda with which I started. Okay, what would it take to do it all? Well, it would take, according to the model, it would take a lot of time because it would be blending and segregation, just as strategic planning and strategic management took a lot of time, and it would take a heck of a lot of institutional work. That would be highly repetitive and involve all those things: reinvention, reiteration, iteration and reintegration. And it might eventually make a difference. And that's where I would stop. So, okay, so basically my message is I think strategy practices matter. I think it's important to understand how they change. And also I might leave us with a thought: we are part of that change ourselves, and that we as academics are researching and proselytizing some of these practices in our everyday work. I'll stop there, take any other questions. Yes. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
I'm Tim. I'm a researcher.
Yeah. Right, hi.
I'm really interested with your idea about permeability.
Permeability, yeah.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if you could talk more about the factors which process this permeability. Because when you talk about accounting, actually, I think you're talking about auditing. Where
You're quite right. You're quite
auditing,
right, yeah.
you know, usually when you get the regulators to say something that change what happened. But even then, like standardization, it's not clear what causes standardization, and we have other practices as well, like management accounting, which is not
much more diffuse, yeah.
And then maybe you could say it's permeable as well. And the discussion in the accounting literature right now is whether we should standardize more or not. And we're not sure what's causing that factors. Do you have any suggestion?
It sounds as if I should have done that parallel study which has been suggested already. Yes, so I would defer. So I'm aware of what Michael's been doing on law. And what he shows is that apparently standard, is this fair? Apparently standard practices are being tweaked, remade all the time on the ground. Though there is a process too of a final regulatory capture where something changes. So I think probably auditing, which I should have said more specifically than accounting, is towards the end of that continuum which I showed earlier, but may not be all the way at the end. So there's a lot of practices which can be tweaked, just as when I was discussing the Bloom work, the practices on an Indian shop floor are tweaked. But I just think that the more permeable the profession, the more scope there is for not just tweaking, but real reinvention and so on and so forth, and iteration.
I suppose my question is more towards whether there would be standardization eventually in strategy as a profession.
No, now that's a very interesting question. I think not. I was involved in about 4 or 5 years ago in something which is called the Strategic Management Society had a professionalisation project. In fact, I was quite attached to this. And we tried to promote in the Strategic Management Society a practitioner or professional track. It failed. One of the things I learned is there's a lot of institutional work in this sort of thing, and the SMS, in the end, wasn't quite prepared to offer professional certification to practitioners. There was another effort way back in the early 1970s when, in the United Kingdom, when what was called then the Long Range Planning Society, which became the Strategic Planning Society, tried to apply for in charter status, official royal charter status, and gave up because, again, the work was too much, the obligations were. So experimentally, or empirically, it seems very hard to impose professionalisation. There's 2 other reasons why it might not happen, or at least one other. It suits McKinsey, BCG and the others very well not to have professionalisation. So they worked against the SMS initiative, for instance, or McKinsey did a bit, because their brand is their certificate of professionalisation. I'm a McKinsey professional, not a strategy professional. And they're not members of professional societies, and they like to keep it that way. So I think there's a variety of reasons for thinking it'll be very hard to professionalise strategic management, including through my own hard experience. Okay? Does that more or less talk to your issue?
Yes.
Thank you. There was somebody else. Louise.
I see why you started from the idea of a permeable profession, but I suppose I'm grappling with whether that's really the main issue, because the way I'm looking at the processes that you've described there, going from long-range planning to, it seems to me that it's much more about a dimension of the power and the knowledge. And you just said then, McKinsey's and the like don't want a professionalisation process.
That's true.
Is it not? Are you not really describing a process which is, from a sociological perspective, more about the maintenance of power through forms of knowledge? So what is happening is they are maintaining their power and their influence over the practitioners by adapting their knowledge as they go on, perhaps in reference to performance or demand. And it's that adaptation of the forms of knowledge which is what you're describing there, more than...
Yeah.
I'm not saying there isn't a professional...
I think there's a lot of truth in that. It is about power, but you winkled that out at me, and I think I'm glad you did. However, I would say this. BCG started with nothing in 1963 and created something which nearly toppled McKinsey, which was the first mover in the whole strategy area, if you like. Cressap and people like that were in the field as well. I mentioned Cressap, I mentioned SRI. A lot of these powerful firms failed. Now, that said, I think how McKinsey reinvented strategic management was definitely a power play in order to keep BCG off its turf or to force it back off its turf. So I think that was, to a certain extent, part of that. And I agree, too, that permeability is partly reinforced by the power of these particular sorts of consulting firms. However, it didn't happen that way in accounting or auditing. So I'm not sure. But I speak not as an expert in the auditing profession. Yeah. So I think power's part of it, but I'm going to hold to at least some of the other story. Power and knowledge. And the knowledge was definitely created by McKinsey with this particular reinforcing intent. Yes.
Just a quick
and then Angela.
Some surprising allies in economics. There's a great paper in QJE in 1962. I've always thought it's been underrated, but it's about the multi-person firm, and it goes after Coase because he's very sort of planning-oriented in the sense of, quote, the entrepreneur coordinator. He talks about the multi-person firm. And
who's this?
I'll say it's a piece by Malmgren.
Yeah.
And then there's a piece in AR by Son Stiglitz about sort of polyarchies and things like that, which suggest sort of more open forms of sort of aggregating decision-making and information and things like that. But, you know, it probably takes in directions that you don't want to go necessarily, but that we have some allies.
I should know about, yes.
Allies there.
Yeah, I need the allies. Angela.
When you talk about recursiveness, I was wondering, I see there recursive work and you identify 3 models of it or dimensions of it. I was wondering if you trace it back to novel institutional forms. Novel institutional forms.
Explain that a little bit more.
I would see it as this work generating something larger than just change on the ground. So when you talked previously about big strategy and about how it changes the field, I kind of expected to see an arrow back.
Yeah, well, that arrow got dropped because it looks a bit naff on this.
Oh, okay.
But it's there. I wanted to focus at that point on the recursive institutional work, but I hope that sort of slightly odd arrow, I'm sure it's possible PowerPoint would allow me to do a continuous one. But, is that the sort of thing you're looking for?
If it was there, it would remind me a lot of the recent trend for strong structuration theory, which I'm sure you know. Like the 2014 Quad and Leibniz sort of work.
Yeah.
I see you're not a fan.
Well, no, I just started in structuration theory. Well, I started in
just skip the structuration.
Transcendental realism, but yeah. Well, yes, okay, I think that's a reasonable point, because I don't think it's far from that. A lot of this is, institutional work is a sort of form of structuration theory, isn't it? There's not many of us who don't have bits of structuration theory somewhere in our mental repertoire, secretly. Tom?
Just on Louise's point, I was just thinking that, I mean, they're not inconsistent stories in the sense that if you think about the desire, if there's sort of a contest often in professions between firms and the professional bodies, then if they have a desire to avoid standardization, your recursive institutional work, the recursivity of it might be a kind of unintended consequence of that strategy. That they avoid the costs of standardization and social closure, but they also avoid the benefits of it.
Yeah. So I think that's very interesting because I'm trying to rewrite a paper at the moment which on this. And one of the ways I start is there's a heck of a lot of people, Mintzberg, Rummel, all the great, Hamill, who's say, why is strategy so repetitive? Why can't we get new practices into this? And they sort of berate us as a sort of rather stupid bunch of, slow learners. But so my argument here is it's not that we're slow learners, but it's the condition of the structure of the profession or the occupation. And that has both benefits and disbenefits. But it's not just we're thick. Yeah, it might be part of it. It's not to exclude that possibility. Michael.
Just to continue that and come back to the struggles we had earlier with this notion of permeability.
Go on.
So far, you've only defined it in terms of the axis and exit of people, but how about the axis and exit of ideas? So because you said, why doesn't this happen in audit, for example? But in audit, I would say the client problem is much more about compliance.
Yeah.
So you have a relatively closed pool of knowledge and closed pool of client problems, whereas when you talk about strategy, that pool is very permeable because it's very proactive and forward-looking, and organizations will always come up with any sort of new kind of strategy problem. So that is more self-generative than in the more closed professions. So there's not just a difference in permeability in terms of people, but also of expertise.
I think that's absolutely right. Ideas come in fairly easily. But what I would argue from a strategist practice point of view is that those ideas are typically carried by people. People, especially in strategy, people selling stuff. Because otherwise, why would you introduce the new idea? Unless you had someone to buy or to employ you. So it is permeable in terms of ideas, but I think to each idea is very often a Bruce Henderson or a Fred Gluck or a C.K. Prahalad who are pushing these ideas. Yeah. So yes, but and people. Yeah. Does that? I mean, is that what you would see in law, for instance? Law doesn't have consulting to law firms much, does it?
Exactly, but I mean, because you brought up the example of audit, that's how all the big four ended up with their accounting, their consulting arms pre-Enron, because the accounting market was limited by clients needing to comply with existing rules and ideas, whereas the strategy market was quote-unquote unlimited, permeable, because you could just invent any number of new strategies and help companies develop new sources of competitive advantage. So I think there is something different in what clients can demand in this collaborative work.
Yes, and of course audit is required. So it's a very different purchasing process. I think that's right. Interestingly enough, so when Deloitte or somebody or PwC want to get in the strategy market, they typically buy a firm with a whole lot of people. They buy Monitor or they buy Booz. So they can't just get the ideas, they need the people as well.
It could also be that we're trying to explain performance differences among an elite group of firms. If you look at just Western firms, say in a specific industry, the fertilizer industry, for instance, and one is using open strategy, one is using strategic management, another is using long-range planning, it might be that you can't really see performance differences. But then you compare that to a fertilizer firm in India, and that's using nothing. It's just sort of doing chaos. And suddenly it switches to any one of those strategy tools, and its performance augments substantially. So it could be that just doing some strategy, whatever that is better than no strategy at all.
Well, yeah, and that's why I think the Bloom and Van Reenen studies of Indian textile firms are really hostages to fortune, because these firms have had no professional management, and if you put a management consultant watching people, it's just like the Hawthorne experiments. If you put a nice Harvard psychologist in a white coat watching people do assemblies, something happens. Yeah? But whether it's because the chap in the white coat is rather good looking or because it's a rather prestigious consulting firm, That's left out of these studies. And that's why I think the Bloom and Van Reenen studies, they've done more work and it's got more sophisticated, but the original work was a little bit suspicious. So I think that's right. And I think when you're comparing Western firms, this is one of the problems in strategy and one of the reasons why we don't see many performance effects. In a more or less competitive market, you must expect that most firms are more or less deploying their resources in a pretty much as efficient as possible way already. So if you change something, it's not going to make much difference. And that's one of the reasons why we don't get stable performance effects in small strategy research studies, which typically look at competitive industries where there's good data, and good data means competitive markets in largely the United States. So those aren't very typical markets. So I'll take that. I suspect that we may be running towards a close. Is that right, Peter?
Actually, yes, because you had to run off slightly earlier for a number of reasons.
Actually, my committee meeting has been cancelled, so I'm free till 4 o'clock.
You looked remarkably unstressed because I thought you had to leave 5 minutes ago. But
everybody else is wanting to.
Just before wrapping things up, 2 points of information. One is to remind you of the second Dean seminar this term, which will be Pedro Bardalo, and that will be roughly 1.5 weeks from now on Monday, the 21st of November. And the second point of information, just as we introduced somebody new at the beginning of the session, introducing somebody new, at this point, Catherine Farfan, who's sitting at the back there, has joined us as a new Research Communications and Impact Officer. So she will be in touch with many colleagues about research, about disseminating that research, about the research newsletter. So I just thought, she just started this Monday, I thought I'd give a chance to point her out to you. And with that, thanks again to Richard for a very interesting seminar. Please join me in thanking him again.